Well, this was a protest that was banned at the 11th hour. It's been planned for 4 weeks or so. Farmers from across the country, from Yorkshire, from Somerset, working with the Met Police to bring about 500 tractors outside Downing Street, angry at, of course, the inheritance tax reforms announced in the budget last year.
When 150,000 tractors flood into London, it's not a traffic jam, it's a statement. And this wasn't a scattered stunt or a single-day spectacle. This was a meticulously coordinated, multi-regional protest aimed straight at the heart of power, Westminster. Over 11 tons of potatoes and cabbages dumped onto the streets didn't just block roads, they blocked any chance of ignoring the message. British farmers had reached their limit. They were done with watching subsidies shrink while fuel and fertilizer, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now. It's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss. Like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. Costs surged. They were done with trade policies that favored cheap imports over local producers. And they were especially done with post-Brexit promises that had failed to deliver any real protection for the domestic agricultural sector. So, they didn't just protest. They transformed London's streets into a battlefield of vegetables and steel. The scale of it alone was staggering. This wasn't a few tractors causing mild disruption. This was mass mobilization, covering multiple regions, operating like a living, breathing network of resistance. Organized, strategic, and built to last. Protesters weren't just marching and going home. They rotated in shifts. They arrived in waves. They came prepared to endure. And that's exactly what they did. For over 10 hours, the protest held. It held as police deployed water cannons. It held as security barriers went up. It held as roads closed and pressure mounted. But the protest didn't escalate to violence. It didn't need to. The endurance was a protest. And that endurance sent a message louder than any shouting ever could. We're not leaving, and we're not backing down. What made it even more potent was the symbolism. They didn't block roads with bricks or banners. They used their own produce. Potatoes, cabbages, the literal fruit of their labor, turned into instruments of disruption. Food as a political weapon. Not thrown, not burned, not wasted, but placed. Right where the government would have to step over it. A visual metaphor for livelihoods being discarded by the very systems meant to protect them. You can't spin your way out of that kind of image. It doesn't just speak. It shouts. The authorities tried to contain it. Police presence was escalated. Streets were locked down. Barricades were deployed. But here's what made this moment different. It wasn't just about control. It was about duration. The government could manage the disruption in the short term, but the longer the tractors stayed, the clearer it became that this wasn't an emergency to be resolved. It was a confrontation to be reckoned with. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone. And it didn't just hit Westminster. This protest echoed across the entire political landscape. It happened at a strategically brutal moment. December, budget season, policy season. The time of year when decisions are set in stone. And now, those decisions were happening in the shadow of a protest that refused to disappear. That's how civil unrest becomes embedded. Not through fire and fury, but through persistence. The normalization of disruption is a powerful shift. When protests last long enough, they stop being exceptional and start being expected. And once they become expected, they start shaping the very rhythm of governance. This wasn't about immediate results. No new subsidy plan was signed on the spot. No sudden reversal of trade deals happened overnight. But that was never the point. This was about changing the dynamic, embedding resistance, making sure that from now on, the conversation around agriculture includes not just the numbers, but the threat of tractors at the gate. The farmers didn't need to win instantly. They needed to establish a new baseline, one where civil resistance is built into the process. One where political decisions are no longer made in a vacuum. One where ignoring rural voices isn't just risky, it's operationally disruptive. And it worked. Because now, the government can't finalize a farming policy without remembering December 2025. They can't quietly sign a trade agreement without wondering if it's going to bring 150,000 tractors back to the capital. They can't reduce subsidies without calculating how long a protest like this can hold out. That's not just disruption. That's leverage. The real shift here wasn't in public policy. It was in protest strategy. For decades, protest has been about urgency, about fast mobilization and rapid impact. But this demonstration turned that idea on its head. It wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. It was slow, grinding, and immovable. And in that, it was more effective than most modern protests have managed to be. By anchoring themselves in place and refusing to escalate, the farmers denied the government any excuse for crackdown. There was no violence to condemn, no chaos to deflect attention. Just farmers, tractors, and the undeniable weight of physical presence. It wasn't a request. It was a reality check. And this kind of protest, organized, symbolic, sustained, has implications far beyond agriculture. Other sectors are watching. Teachers, nurses, public transport unions. You've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week, and like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. Postal workers. Any group that's been sidelined, underfunded, or politically ignored just got a live demonstration of what's possible when disruption becomes disciplined. Because this protest wasn't random, it was a framework, a living example of how resistance can operate without falling into the traps of burnout or backlash. And it was proof that the system doesn't have a real playbook for this kind of pressure. It's easy to dismiss a rally. It's harder to dismiss a movement that refuses to go away. And this one didn't. Even when the tractors left, the political tension remained. The conversation had changed. The expectations had changed. And most importantly, the power balance had shifted. Because what happens when government can't operate without factoring in the risk of future disruption? What happens when long-term civil resistance becomes part of the equation? It's not just about slowing things down. It's about redefining how political decisions are made. Governance becomes more reactive, more cautious, more hedged. Every move, every budget cut, every policy rollout, suddenly it all comes with a risk calculation. What if they come back? That's the power of normalization, when unrest isn't an outlier but a variable. And yes, that has consequences for government stability, for long-term policymaking, for public confidence. Because when protest becomes routine, the line between democracy and dysfunction starts to blur. People get used to disruption. Politicians start working around it. And slowly, legitimacy erodes, not with a bang, but with a quiet shift in expectations. That's what this protest did. It redefined the rules. It made endurance a viable political tool. And in doing so, it changed the future, not just for farmers, but for every sector that feels like shouting into the void. The old playbook is gone. The game has changed. And now, governments are operating in a landscape where civil discontent isn't a moment. It's a mechanism, not a breakdown, but a built-in feature of modern governance. That's a difficult environment to govern in, but it's the one we have now. And unless these grievances are actually addressed, not just managed, this new normal is only going to get more entrenched. More sectors will adopt the model. More cities will see it replicated. More policies will be held hostage by the fear of persistent protest. Because when people realize that being ignored is a strategy they can reverse, and that physical presence carries more weight than digital outrage, they stop waiting for permission. They just show up. That's what happened here. And it's not going away. Let us know what you think. Was this the future of protest or a warning sign of political dysfunction? With tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now, it's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss, like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. Should governments treat sustained demonstrations like these as threats or as pressure to finally listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Like this if it made you rethink what protest looks like in 2025. And subscribe for more breakdowns of the real-time meltdowns reshaping public life. Because the streets are speaking louder than ever. and they are just getting started. So where do we go from here? The tractors may have returned to the countryside, and the streets might look clean again. But don't be fooled. This wasn't a temporary storm. This was a shift in the atmosphere, and you can feel it. In government meetings, in rural communities, even in the public response online. This protest lodged itself into the national conversation, not because it was loud, but because it lasted. That's the real story here. Not that farmers protested. Protests happen all the time. The real takeaway is that this protest didn't blow over. It wasn't a blip. It embedded. It planted itself in the system and dared the system to pretend it wasn't there. And now, the system has a problem. Because once protests become sustainable, once people realize they don't need to burn out to make a point, it stops being a disruption and starts being part of the governance cycle itself. That's what's happened. What we saw wasn't just civil unrest. It was civil recalibration, and it's strategic to its core. This protest was timed during the most politically sensitive part of the year. End-of-year budgets, finalized policy drafts, the part of the calendar where decisions that shape the next 12 months get locked in. The farmers didn't just show up to shout. They showed up to shape the political terrain before it hardened. And now every department that touches rural policy is on notice. Because the protest didn't just speak to one issue. It pointed at the entire apparatus. Subsidies, trade, post-Brexit fallout, supply chain vulnerabilities, agricultural regulation. It was all on the table. The farmers didn't limit their grievance to one ministry. They surrounded the symbolic heart of power and said, all of you need to listen. That's hard to counter. You can't sidestep something that's strategic. And even harder to ignore is the way the government failed to resolve it. 10+ hours of protest, heavy police presence, water cannons on standby, roads blocked off, and still no dispersal, no resolution, just management. That's what this was, not an effort to solve the problem, but to contain it. But containment isn't control. If anything, the prolonged stalemate just reinforced the protest's legitimacy. I know things feel really heavy in the UK right now. There's a lot of division and noise on the streets, but I want this channel to be a place where we can come together. If you want to be part of a supportive community, please subscribe. And like this video to show some love to everyone feeling anxious about the state of things right now. Stay safe out there, everyone. It showed that the state couldn't sweep this under the rug, couldn't police its way out of it, couldn't PR spin its way to safety. The best they could do was wait, and hope the tractors would leave before the cameras lost interest. Spoiler alert, the tractors left, but the cameras didn't. Because even after the wheels rolled out, the images remained. Westminster under siege. Fresh produce wilting in the middle of the street. Tractors lined up like a mechanical picket line. That's not a spectacle you forget. That's a visual echo. And now every policymaker has that image burned into their brain. That's a kind of leverage that doesn't go away. It hangs over every decision, every press release, every policy announcement that dares to downplay rural concerns. Because now there's a precedent, one that says, if the government ignores rural Britain will park itself on your doorstep. No violence, no chaos, just cold, calculated disruption. And the implications? They are massive, because now that this method has been proven effective, it becomes a model, not just for farmers, but for anyone with the organization and willpower to replicate it. Health workers, educators, transport unions, local councils, all of them just saw a template. High coordination, clear symbolism, no violence, sustained presence. It's not about overthrowing power, it's about outlasting it. That's a shift. From confrontational protest to persistent presence. And that's what the government wasn't prepared for. They were geared up for a flashpoint. They got a pressure cooker. This is a kind of protest that doesn't need to win fast because it doesn't plan to leave. And the state is now stuck with the uncomfortable truth. Endurance might be the most powerful political tool of the decade. Because think about it. What do you do when people show up with their tractors and their food, not to destroy, but to demonstrate? Not to riot, but to remind you of everything you've ignored? You can't villainize them. You can't arrest them all. You can't deploy force without a backlash. So instead, you sit, you negotiate, you delay, you try to outweight them. But they already knew that. That's why they didn't come to fight. They came to linger. And now that tactic is in the air. It's been documented, dissected, admired, even by people who have nothing to do with agriculture. Because it's not just about farming anymore, it's about frustration, economic frustration, political exclusion, institutional fatigue. You've seen the headlines, but the atmosphere down here is completely different. Subscribe so you don't miss the raw footage I'm releasing later this week, and like this video to help push this unfiltered reporting up the algorithm. All the groups feeling unheard just watch a demonstration of exactly how to get attention. Not by breaking things, but by refusing to vanish. And the more this kind of protest becomes normalized, the more difficult governing becomes. Because you're no longer dealing with one-off crises. You're dealing with a new rhythm. One where unrest is always on the edge of returning. One where any policy decision could trigger the next wave. And one where disruption doesn't look like violence. It looks like tractors in traffic and potatoes on the pavement. And that's not something you can shut down easily. Because once the public starts accepting that kind of protest as just part of political life, the old tools of suppression lose their effect. Police? Barriers? Messaging? Too late. If people see persistent protest as justified, they're not going to turn against it. They're going to start planning around it. Which means government isn't just fighting protesters, it's losing the room. And when you lose the room, you lose momentum, authority, legitimacy. So yes, the farmers may not have walked away with immediate victories. But in terms of changing the game, they won. Because now every politician, every journalist, every policy analyst has to consider what happens if this protest becomes a format. What happens when every ignored group starts strategizing for the long haul? That's the world we're now living in. A world where protest isn't a moment, it's a process. A world where endurance can outweigh power. A world where policy can no longer move forward unless it accounts for who might block the roads next. And let's be honest, this wasn't just about agriculture. It was about control. It was about who gets to shape the conversation, who gets to be heard, and who gets left behind. The farmers made sure they weren't left behind. They brought the margins to the center. They dragged their grievances into the spotlight and made sure no one could look away. And now they've handed the blueprint to everyone else. This is how movements change things. Not always by forcing the system to respond, but by forcing it to adapt. And adaptation takes time. It takes recognition. It takes a political class willing to admit that maybe, just maybe, the people they thought were easy to ignore are the ones holding the keys to public sentiment. So, if you're wondering whether this protest mattered, it did. Not because it solved everything, but because it made solving nothing no longer an option. And if you're still thinking this was just about a bunch of tractors and some disgruntled farmers blocking roads, you're missing the bigger picture. Because what happened in London wasn't just a one-off display of rural rage. It was a stress test on the entire political system. A live experiment in how far, with tensions rising across the UK and thousands taking to the streets of London right now, it's more important than ever to see the full picture. If you want to stay updated on the situation as it unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. I'm covering the angles the mainstream media might miss. Like this video if you believe in unfiltered reporting. Public can go when they organize, mobilize, and refuse to back down. And the results? Let's just say the system didn't pass with flying colors. Governments are built to deal with crises. Flash floods, market crashes, strikes that last a day or two. But what they are not built for, what they cannot handle efficiently, is a protest that doesn't go away. A protest that isn't trying to shut down the system overnight, but instead works to exhaust it. Slowly, deliberately, publicly. That's exactly what this was. And that's why it matters so much more than most people think. Because endurance has a cost. Not just for the protesters, but for the state. Every extra hour those tractors stayed in London, that's another hour of police overtime. Another hour of traffic rerouting. Another hour of political pressure mounting behind closed doors. Another hour of headlines the government doesn't want written. And unlike protests fueled by anger and chaos, this one was calm. It was structured. It didn't need a moment of climax because it was the moment. That's why it hit so hard. Because for once, the drama wasn't in what people were shouting. It was in the silence. The sheer presence of these farmers, rotating in shifts, prepared to stay unfazed by the pushback, was louder than any chant or placard ever could be. And when the disruption becomes routine, when the barricades become background noise, that's when the protest starts winning in ways no policy paper can prepare for. Think about the timing again. End of the year. Policy finalizations. Budgets on the table. If you're going to force your issue into the conversation, this is the moment. And they nailed it. Now, every document being finalized for the new year has to pass a new test. Will this make the farmers come back? That question is now built into the political process. Whether politicians admit it or not, the possibility of another massive demonstration isn't just a threat. It's a baseline. That's what happens when disruption becomes normalized. It stops being an outlier and starts becoming a part of how power is negotiated. And that's a very dangerous place for the government to be. Because if rural communities that have historically been told to wait, to be patient, to trust the system, have now learned that direct, enduring protest gets results, even if those results are just fear and hesitation, what's to stop the next group? What's to stop transport workers from adopting the same tactics? What's to stop nurses? Teachers? If the government can't resolve a tractor protest without letting it burn itself out, what happens when the next movement doesn't burn out? What happens when multiple sectors use the same tactics at the same time? This wasn't a glitch. This was a preview. And here's the thing. It wasn't just political insiders who were watching. The public saw this unfold. They saw the farmers hold their ground. They saw a protest with no violence, no looting, no tear gas. Just a message, backed by logistics and endurance, that refused to leave the conversation. And let's be real, a lot of people related to that. Because the deeper story here, the part that doesn't get captured in aerial shots of tractors or piles of cabbages, is that this protest wasn't driven by radicalism. It was driven by fatigue. Economic fatigue. Political fatigue. The slow, grinding exhaustion of communities who've been told to tighten their belts while watching their livelihoods get undercut by policies they never had a say in. That's what made this protest feel so inevitable. It wasn't a shock. It was a natural outcome of years of policy neglect, rising costs, and increasing detachment between those who make the decisions and those who have to live with them. This was a consequence of governing in a way that treats rural communities like background noise. And now, the government's facing a whole new kind of pressure. One it can't suppress. One it can't ignore. One it knows might be waiting to roll back into London at any moment. Because while this protest may not have forced a legislative breakthrough, it did force a mental one. It changed the way people think about protest. It changed the expectations. And once the public starts expecting protests like this, calm, coordinated, and long-lasting, every political misstep carries a new risk. Not of riots, not of headlines, but of returning presence, of tractors in the rearview mirror, of produce on the pavement. Again. And that kind of pressure is subtle but suffocating. It makes governing harder. It makes policy riskier. It makes every minister wonder, before they finalize anything, what's the real cost of this decision? Not just economically, but politically, socially, publicly. And that's why this protest is still reverberating. Because the farmers didn't just show up. They showed how to show up. They wrote the new rules. They walked in with grievances and left behind a template. So, what happens now? Maybe the government listens. Maybe they sit down with agricultural leaders and actually rethink how policy decisions are made. Maybe rural subsidies get revisited. Maybe trade terms are re-examined. Or maybe they don't. And if they don't, then this isn't over. It's a pause, a tactical retreat, a reset before round two. Because the power of a movement like this isn't in how loud it is. It's in how prepared it is to return. And based on how strategically this first protest was executed, they are ready. They've done it once. And now they know exactly what works. So if the government thinks they can just outweight the problem, they are mistaken. Because this protest has already changed how governance works in the UK. From this point forward, sustained civil disobedience isn't just something that might happen. It's something politicians have to plan for. And whether they like it or not, the age of polite silence from rural communities is over. The tractors have rolled in once. And everyone knows they can roll in again. So let's finish what we started. Because this isn't just a story of 150,000 tractors and a mountain of potatoes dumped onto the Capitol's front steps. This is about what it means when everyday people, with no billionaire backers, no lobbyists, and no PR firms, manage to shake the ground beneath the UK's political centre without even raising their voices. What we saw in December 2025 wasn't chaos. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that emerges only when a system is pushed far enough to reveal its own cracks. And those cracks? They're not going away. They've been deepening for years, papered over with promises, delays, vague statements about working groups and stakeholder consultations. But none of those things feed families. None of them keep a farm running when fuel doubles in price, or when trade agreements make homegrown crops less profitable than imported goods. And the farmers knew it. They knew that polite lobbying wasn't working, that petitions and parliamentary inquiries were being buried, that rural voices weren't just being ignored. They were being erased from the conversation entirely. So they changed the method. They brought the conversation to the capital, not with violence, not with spectacle, but with tractors, potatoes, and a level of discipline that made it impossible to ignore. That's what made this protest so powerful. It wasn't an explosion. It was a slow siege. It didn't demand attention. It commanded it. And what's truly wild? The fact that it worked without traditional escalation. Because the government never expected something this massive to remain so restrained. They expected anger. They expected chaos. Maybe even arrests. But instead, they got strategy, composure, and a highly visible reminder that when people are organized enough, they don't need to shout. They just need to stay. And they did stay, for over 10 hours, through police pressure, through security lockdowns, through barrier deployments and surveillance. The authorities threw everything short of mass arrest of the farmers, and still the movement held. That is the power of preparation. That is the strength of a protest that isn't built for a moment, but for momentum. And here's a part no one in power wants to say out loud. Once a movement like this gets rolling, once it proves it can organize across regions, sustain itself, and refuse to fade, it gains a form of legitimacy that's almost impossible to dismantle. The public saw this, and whether they agreed with every detail of the farmers' demands or not, they recognized something real, something grounded in survival, not ideology. Because there's something deeply relatable about people saying, we just want to be able to make a living. And doing it in a way that was firm without being violent, disruptive without being reckless. The UK government tried to contain the situation with optics, water cannons, barricades, police vans lined up like it was a G20 summit. But that just made it worse. Because all of those visuals, meant to intimidate, only underscored how serious the farmers were. It didn't look like they were causing a crisis. It looked like they were responding to one. And that's the moment the narrative flipped. This wasn't a fringe movement anymore. It was a mirror held up to Westminster, reflecting years of neglect, decades of slow policy erosion, and the growing disconnect between rural life and national leadership. And now, the mirror won't go away. Because once a group plants itself in the middle of your capital and survives the storm, you don't just forget them. You start calculating around them. That's what's happening now. Government officials may not admit it publicly, but behind closed doors, every policy planning session has a new column, protest risk. Every decision about trade, energy, or subsidies has to factor in not just public response, but prolonged public response. Not flash mob outrage, but tractor-level endurance. This isn't just a new kind of protest. It's a new form of political participation. One that's no longer based on trust in the system, but on pressure around the system. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When people don't feel heard, they don't give up. They adapt. And once they realize their presence alone can force a political machine to slow down, even without smashing windows or clashing with police, it opens up an entirely new playbook. And now that playbook is out there, that's what the tractors left behind. Not just blocked roads and smashed vegetables, but a blueprint. And the people watching most closely, other industries, other sectors, other communities who spent years being told to wait their turn, to be patient, to trust the process. Now they've seen what happens when you stop trusting and start showing up. In numbers, in coordination, with symbols that speak louder than any speech ever could. And for the government, that's a new danger. Because it's no longer just about one protest. It's about the replication of that protest, the normalization of it, the slow transformation of civil resistance from rare outburst to expected response. And once that becomes a pattern, stability stops being a given. It becomes something the government has to constantly negotiate, maintain, and work around. That's where things are now. Not in outright collapse, but in a kind of structural fatigue. A political environment where confidence slowly erodes, not because of one event, but because of many, because of the steady accumulation of pressure, friction, and unresolved grievances. And that's what this protest did best. It didn't explode. It accumulated. It led. It reminded everyone watching that systems built to manage dissent aren't built to manage persistence. And persistence is what they got. Now, sure, there will be people who dismiss all of this, who say it was just traffic, just a stunt, just a bunch of farmers looking for attention. But those people are missing the forest for the trees, because this wasn't about disruption for disruption's sake. It was about building leverage, redefining what it means to be present in the political process when traditional routes have failed. The tractors may have left the streets, but their impact hasn't gone anywhere. It's in every policymaker's inbox, every meeting agenda, every risk assessment. And whether or not the government chooses to acknowledge that publicly, it doesn't matter. Because now, every protest that comes after this one will be measured against the farmers of December 2025. Did it last as long? Was it as organized? Did it shift the narrative like that one did? Because that protest changed the standard. And for those who still believe protest is only valid if it ends in legislative change, consider this. Not all victories come in the form of immediate policy. Some come in the form of influence, of shifting the rhythm, of planting a flag in the ground and forcing those in power to walk around it for the rest of the year. That's what these farmers did. They planted that flag. They didn't win a war. They redefined the battlefield. Because let's be honest, once the tractors rolled out of London, they didn't leave behind silence. They left behind a void, a tension, a question that still hasn't been answered. What now? Not just for the farmers, but for everyone who watched this unfold. Everyone who saw a protest unfold with no central leader, no violent outburst, and no single demand, and yet somehow managed to wedge itself into the core of the national conversation. Because that's a part that makes this impossible to brush off. It wasn't reactive. It was deliberate. These farmers weren't lashing out. They were making a move, a strategic, symbolic move. And now, the government is walking through a political minefield they didn't even realize they were standing on. Every conversation in Westminster about trade or subsidies now starts with an asterisk. Every late-night policy briefing includes a quiet, unspoken fear. What if they come back? Because that fear isn't abstract anymore. It has shape. It has precedent. It has 11 tons of potatoes rotting in their memory, and the image of tractors lining Westminster like sentinels. That kind of protest doesn't just fade away. It gets studied. It gets adopted. And that's what makes us different. It's not just the farmers who learn something. It's everyone. Public workers, union leaders, disenfranchised communities. They saw the proof. When power refuses to listen, presence speaks louder than policy. This wasn't the loudest protest we've ever seen, but it was one of the clearest. It said, "We're not here to destroy. We're here to disrupt, peacefully, persistently, and we'll do it again." That's not a threat. That's a warning label on every future political decision involving rural life. And look, there's no going back to the old way of ignoring this. That door is shut, permanently. The government can't play surprise anymore. They can't pretend they didn't see the signs. Because the signs were rolling through London, in daylight, with hazard lights on. So yes, this moment mattered. Maybe more than any of us realize in real time. Because what it really exposed wasn't just a broken policy, it was a broken assumption. The idea that people without traditional power can't do anything about it. The idea that disruption needs to be loud, chaotic, or dangerous to be effective. These farmers prove that wrong. Completely. If you made it this far, let us know your take. Was this the start of something bigger? Or a warning governments will quickly try to forget? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit like if you felt the weight of this protest. And subscribe to stay locked in, because if this is a new normal, we've got a front row seat to a whole new era of political reckoning.